big, yeah. Okay, how do I look? Well, I shouldn't have taken this thinking about being recorded. Anyway.
I think it looks fine.
Yeah.
I think that's it.
I was searching for that function for years. So how do you convert that format into that presentation? Because this is 69 fourths, and this is correct, how she did it.
Right.
What did you do?
All I did there was move from, I don't think it's anything to do with me, I think it's the way you've set up the presentation. All I
No,
did,
you see the difference. This is
Yeah.
right, and this isn't.
Sorry?
No, this is stretched.
34.
And this is the original form.
Yeah, 34 for about 34 minutes,
No,
ideally.
I do not want to.
So,
but I
if
do
I'm
not-
at 30
don't
minutes,
know how you
let me
got
know,
that.
because then I really want to wrap up. Yeah, 30 minutes, then maximum 5 minutes more, and I'll try
I'll give you a
to...
signal in 30 minutes.
Yeah, that's great.
don't mind that there. I have no idea, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay, shall we begin? I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, Helen de Cruz from Oxford Brookes University, and the title of her paper is Expert Disagreement in Science and Religion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is a very germinal paper, which has more to do with the schedule of getting this ready, but so it would be very useful to hear your comments about this. So what I'm going to talk about is the question of what we should do if we are faced with experts who disagree. And this question was first tackled by Alvin Goldman in a paper in 2001, Experts, Which Ones Should We Trust? And it's come up a couple of times this morning already about what do you do if you are not an expert in the domain? What do you do if you are faced with experts who disagree? Now, there do seem to be, or there are, experts in many domains. So, for example, science, religion, politics. And these experts often disagree. That disagreement is not a superficial disagreement. It's not just about what the evidence says, but it's a deep disagreement. It's a disagreement about what are the right methods to come. So the beautiful example this morning that we heard was about whether telescopes or the Bible would be the best way to come to knowledge about, what's it again, planets, Jupiter, moons. So this is a worrisome phenomenon, because you may ask, if experts disagree even about which methods to use or which epistemic principles to use, are there any experts at all? So there is a worry in which this threatens the notion of expertise. Now, non-experts do have to make decisions about which experts to trust. Practically speaking, we have to make such decisions. So that's the main scope of the paper. Now, I tend to think that actually when we learn a great deal from testimony. In fact, the amount of beliefs that we have, if you were to be able to numerically put all your occurrent and non-occurrent beliefs together, it would seem to be that the number of beliefs that we learn through testimony is staggering. And that's why I think that in general the heuristics that we have are sensible. And recently, the psychology of testimony has highlighted two ways in which people learn from experts or in general from people who know more than they do about a certain situation. And these two heuristics, you see them already come up in children as young as 4 or 5 years of age. The first is perceived benevolence. So people tend to want to learn from people who seem friendly and nice towards them, who seem well disposed towards them. And that makes sense, because if you're going to learn from somebody and it seems that that person is not well disposed to you, then it could well be that they are trying to harm you by telling you something that is false. So it is sensible to look for cues of benevolence. And the second one is the perceived competence. And this has been also shown in the recent literature, that young children might be particularly unforgiving when people make basic semantic mistakes, for example. They're less likely to trust somebody if you have somebody who says, this is a parakeet or something like that, then they sort of don't trust that person in later instances. It's a so-called pitchfork effect where you become less forgiving for somebody who makes basic errors. And these seem to be really sensible heuristics. But in a very recent paper, Neil Levi has argued that sometimes these heuristics go awry. So, for example, he says that when scientific knowledge is heavily politicized, as is the case of evolutionary theory in the United States and climate change, that people tend to become very tribal. And so what you have is liberals who accept evolutionary theory and conservatives who reject evolutionary theory. And the same with climate change. But if you ask people, could you please explain how climate change works? They are terrible at it. So experiments by Rani and colleagues where they ask people about explaining how climate change works. And they take things like ozone layers and other things that don't really have anything to do with climate change. And so there's not much difference between conservatives and liberals. So what explains the big difference? The difference seems to be that conservatives see people who accept climate change and evolution as less benevolent towards them, as less part of sort of their tribe. And so basically, Levi thinks that liberals in this case are epistemically lucky about climate change. They just happen to be happy following people that they think are part of their sort of tribe, are benevolent towards them. So it's a nutty subject about how do you know what expert to trust? How do you go about trusting experts who disagree? Now, obviously, in the case of climate change, there seems to be a widespread consensus among scientists, and this is one of the things that we say, well, climate change is well established because of the amount of consensus. But there are nevertheless many, many areas in which there is disagreement among scientists. So I'll just, so this gives rise to a number of questions. What notion of expertise should we use? To what extent did the disagreement in a domain D threaten the notion of expertise in D? Now that's a deeply problematic, so that's a very nettly issue. And I'm not going to talk much about question 2. So I'm going to focus instead on question 1, and then question 3, to what extent should you as a novice defer to experts? And this was illustrated in a paper this morning, where you have somebody, a car mechanic, well, somebody who brings a car to a car mechanic. The car mechanic says something about the car, and she has some knowledge, but the car mechanic says something different. So should you completely defer to the expert too? In what extent can you bracket off your own evidence and your own reasons? Which experts should you trust, especially in the case of disagreements? So those are questions that I'm going to talk about. So I'll first talk about what an expert might be, and I'll talk about 3 models of expertise. Zagzebski's expert as authority, Lackey's expert as an advisor. I'll talk about the expert as teacher, and then finally, and hopefully I'll try to make this cohesive, I'll talk about Maimonides, 12th century Jewish philosopher. Heuristics on how to deal with expert disagreement, because I think his heuristics are really useful and might be helpful. Okay, so what is an expert? Now, a sort of really mainstream, sort of commonsensical definition might be the veritistic notion. That has to do with truth. An expert is just somebody who has lots of true beliefs. And this is what Goldman used in his 2001 sort of classic paper on the subject. An expert in the strong sense in domain D is someone who possesses an extensive fund of knowledge, so fund of justified true belief, or even just merely true belief, and the set of skills or method apps for successful deployment of this knowledge to new questions in the domain. Now, this is all good and well, but the problem is that in many controversial areas, it only becomes later apparent whether the person indeed has a whole bunch of true beliefs. So we just don't know if that's the case. So maybe we should go to sort of a justificatory or evidential notion, and this is what Goldman has proposed more recently. S is an expert with respect to domain D if and only if S possesses substantially more and or better evidence concerning propositions in D than most people in relevant comparison classes. This is somewhat better, but it's still problematic because How do you know what relevant evidence is, especially if you have experts disagreeing? How do you know which expert has more versified beliefs? So you still have problems. Collins and Evans had this book on expertise, and they go completely a sort of practice way. So basically you have a sort of similar division and in other domains, intellectualism, practicalism, in how far is expertise something practical, or in how far is it having beliefs that are reducible to propositional beliefs. And they have a sort of skill idea. And they have the idea of contributory expertise. Contributory expertise, and they see this sort of as the notion of expertise, enables those who have acquired an expert skill to contribute to the domain to which the expertise pertains. So it's the stuff, you can do stuff. And this seems to align again with lots of commonsensical ideas about expertise. So a birder can distinguish birds, a car mechanic can fix cars, a plumber can fix. So there's this idea that an expert can do stuff. And here is a sort of hybrid definition that Goldman put up, sort of taking that into account, the idea of capacities and skills. So S is an expert in domain D, if and only if S has the capacity to help others. Now, the reason that he puts it as capacity is that presumably there would be somebody who's an expert but somehow never gets to helping others because of epistemic injustice. Maybe people don't want to ask this person or don't trust that they're experts. But they have this capacity, especially to help, especially laypersons, solve a variety of problems in D or execute an assortment of tasks in D in which the latter would not be able to solve or execute on their own. S can provide such help by imparting to the layperson or other client his/her distinctive knowledge or skills. So being able to do things in the domain is inextricably linked to the ability to impart your knowledge. Now, there are, of course, people who are brilliant scientists and really bad teachers. You have those people. But it does seem to be that as a sort of byproduct of having certain expert skills comes the ability to impart the skills. And in fact, so Sterelny makes this point this is Sterelny on a birding expedition, he makes this point in the Evolved Apprentice. He says, I'm an Australian birder, and it's very easy to present myself as a birder. I don't have to do much effort. Of course, he had to have an enormous amount of effort to get this good, but now he can just sort of signal it very cheaply. And so it's easy to learn from him. By contrast, you have people who would know something, and Collins and Evans talk about this briefly. They know something about a certain domain, but only insofar as they can talk about it. So, for example, you have these sociologists following Latour and other such people in the 80s, etc., and they went into the lab and they talked to microbiologists, and then they knew a lot about microbiology, but just put them in front of a reagent or whatever it is, and they wouldn't be able to know what to do. But so in the normal circumstances, if you have expertise, you can sort of signal it very cheaply. You can impart it in a relatively straightforward way. The ability to transmit knowledge is a byproduct of the knowledge that you gained while acquiring the expertise. Now, the expert might need some pedagogical and communication training. So, for example, Oxford Brookes organizes media training days where we learn to speak to journalists. But other than that, it's sort of a nice free byproduct. So, I'm now going to talk about science and religion, where we have experts, or where there seem to be experts, and where there seems to be disagreement, and this disagreement is deep. Now, this seems to threaten the notion of expertise itself at some domain, and especially in the religious domain. This has been forwarded as an idea that we should actually not think that any of these religious proclamations are true because they are sort of contradicting each other. And this seems to be a fortiori true, given that religious experts also disagree. A related question is, well, even if it's the case that some of them do speak the truth, how do we know which experts to trust. How can we, as novices who don't know anything about the domain, know which experts to trust? So I'll now talk about two models that have been recently developed, and I'll then put forward my own model. So the first model is the expert as authority model developed by Linda Zagzebski. So, and she relies on a track record argument. Now suppose that there is an expert in a given domain. Say, take the car mechanic example that we heard this morning. I have a terrible car. I acquired it when it was 12 years old and it keeps on falling apart. And I keep on going to, and I know something about cars, but not that much. And I keep on going to the same car mechanic. And let's say that she's really good and she knows like 90% of the time, she knows what's wrong with the car. Whereas I only know what's wrong with the car in about 40% of cases. Now, in this case, I will be more wrong, have a worse track record than expert E in the domain of car mechanics. So, if I only follow E some of the time and other things I think, yeah, you know, I'm going with my gut this time and other things I think I'm going to follow, I will end up with a worse record at getting at the truth than if I just followed her. If I just followed her, I have 90%. If I follow her most of the time and I follow my gut enough, then it's going to be a lot more than it's going to go closer to the 40% baseline probability that I have. So therefore, it seems rational, given that I'm not the expert, I should follow expert E on matters in D all the time, hence authority. And she draws on this nice example of an experiment in which rats outperform people. In this experiment, you have a light that flashes red or green. It flashes green 75% of the time and red 25% of the time. And basically, if you guess correctly what the light color is going to be, then you get a reward, and if you guess wrong, then you get no reward. Now, what rats do is they follow the strategy of always predicting green. And that's how they come to 75%. On the other hand, humans have this sort of irresistible desire of just trying to throw a few random numbers in. And so humans get up with a worse track records than the rats. So, in this case, it seems that the rats, they follow this 75% rule, and they always get it, well, they get it right 75% of the time. And the same with an expert. If you have an expert, you trust the expert, you just follow the expert all of the time. So far, so good. There's something to be said for this track record argument. However, given my reliance on the expert, I'd better pick a really good one. What if I pick the wrong expert? Disagreement becomes problematic. What do I do? How do I decide? So this is a problem for the track record, for the authority. The moment there's more than one expert and they start disagreeing, I have a big problem. Second problem. Now, this provides all of the resources for rendering rational the beliefs of paradigmatically irrational communities, such as white supremacists, young earth creationists, flat earthers. Suppose that I say, okay, I'm choosing these people to be really experts in this domain, and I'm going to follow whatever they say. You end up with terrible, wrong beliefs. So Lackey forwards a second model. And her model is to not see the expert as this authority to end it all, but as an advisor. And she takes as examples people like expert witnesses in a trial. Expert witnesses in a trial don't determine the outcome of the trial, as they would in the authority model. No, we put forward these experts. We can even put forward different experts who disagree. And then on the basis of that, we make up our minds. So they advise us, but ultimately, we don't screen off our own reasons. You have the training coach. For example, training coach, the person says, don't eat that donut and 20 push-ups, etc. And you trust that person to be sure, but you're not going to completely comply. I mean, after all, you know the limits of your body better than they do. Ethics consultants as hospitals, again. So, for example, for deciding whether or not to go through with in vitro fertilization, they prevent arguments, but ultimately it's down to you to decide. So the important feature of this is that we can use our own reasons, evaluate the experts, can wonder, are they explaining it well? Does this make sense? Does this accord with my own reasons? We make up our minds. And the nice thing is that since we're looking for advice and guidance, disagreement is not that big a problem. In fact, disagreement is a good thing in this respect, because it's good to, like, for example, when you want to have a second opinion from a medic, you get that second opinion. Whereas in the expert as authority model, as soon as a disagreement, it's a big problem, because then you get to this sort of intractable epistemic problem about which expert do I choose. Here you use your own reason, you're looking at the experts, and you make up your mind. But I think it's still a problem. I think disagreement still poses a problem. So I think the positive is that the model, Lackey's model says we should never screen off our own reasons in a domain where we rely on experts. And I think it's absolutely right. But it still doesn't give you sort of much of a heuristic about what to do when we're faced with these disagreeing experts. And it puts a lot of weight on ourselves, in fact. I mean, after all, we're in charge, the experts, they're just advising it, and we come to our own conclusions. So it's just not clear to me whether that would always give you the right sort of epistemically right response. So I want to put forward a third model of what we should regard experts as. And I think a fruitful model is to see experts as teachers. Now, they're not always teachers, but it is a useful way to look at it. So the novice-expert relationship is very often a pupil-teaching relationship. And in fact, teaching is culturally pervasive. And in recent decades, so the last 5 to 10 years, both in cognitive science and in philosophy of cognitive science, people have discovered teaching as this really, really crucial thing, this really crucial element of how skills are transmitted. So people used to think, this was in the 80s and 90s, that imitation was the thing that really did it for human cultural transmission, but imitation doesn't really work that well, because for one thing, when you imitate, you don't know what's working and what isn't. So you have to be very conservative with the imitation. Whereas teaching allows us to really get control of the thing that's being taught and to understand it. And some people, such as Chibra and Gergely, argue that humans are natural pedagogues, that's what we do, that's how we transmit knowledge, that's the sort of niche that we have as beings since presumably somewhere at the middle Pleistocene. Now, there was initially skepticism about this idea that teaching is so important for us and for knowledge transmission, because the claim went that only Westerners teach. This sort of situation where I'm standing in front of you and talking about things is not really a teaching situation, but anyway, it's a workshop situation. But that would be a uniquely Western situation. But in fact, it turns out that it's cross-culturally quite widespread, even though teaching isn't always as verbal and isn't always as top-down and all as it is in Western cultures. I'll just give you one example. This is the Micronesian star compass. So in Micronesia is a whole bunch of islands, and if you go with your canoe from one island to another and you miss, then you're just in the middle of the ocean and there's just salt water and you die horribly. So anyway, you have to be able to navigate. And so this is the star compass, where basically you have, these are stars, different stars, and you see them there in that moving little GIF. And so what happens is that you learn from a very early age, as you can see, you learn what these stars are and you learn to orientate, and so you don't get lost and you don't die in the middle of the ocean. And there's lots of instances of teaching like that. So teaching is closely, Alan Fridland has argued, that teaching is the thing that ultimately gets us complex cumulative culture because it allows for innovation. Pure imitation tends to be conservative, and in order to innovate, you have to understand. And in fact, teaching does that. It helps you, it brings also something like a transmission of reasons, a transmission of understanding. Now, Adam and I are sort of in the germinal beginnings of a paper where we're just wondering about, can you transmit understanding testimonially? But I think you can, as teachers, and we do it. a lot. So this is just one of the recent papers showing, and this is just where people had to flake older one technology, and it turns out that if they do teaching, gestural teaching, basic teaching, verbal teaching, it goes a lot better than imitation alone. Now, I think that the teaching model is not only very salient, given that testimonial transmission is importantly transmission through teaching, but I think it's also interesting to look at expert disagreement, because both in the domains of science and religion, the domains under discussion, teaching and expertise are very closely linked. So in the late 18th century in Germany, something interesting was stirring. You had universities such as the Göttingen University, where there was this close interaction between teaching and research. And von Humboldt wrote out this sort of charter, this statement about the Einheit von Lehre und Forschung, a holistic combination of teaching and research. So the idea is there that students aren't just passive founts of receptacles of knowledge, but that they actively engage and participate in knowledge production. And that research ideally should help to inform teaching, so that we can use our research to impart to students. And basically, if you look at contemporary universities, lots of universities have adopted this model. The US universities are very interesting, sort of hybrid of different things, but they do have this research plus teaching to an important extent. Now in religion, very interestingly, you see the same thing, that experts are often referred to as teachers, in some religious traditions explicitly. So for example, in Judaism, you have rabbis. Now rabbis aren't priests. Rabbis are teachers. They have no special authority to perform rituals, which is what priests have, but they have a great knowledge of the Jewish law, and they thereby have the authority to transmit it. You have gurus in Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and again, guru means teacher. Now, so we typically, using this teacher model, I think we can get some idea about how to trust experts. I think one of the key things is that teachers do help to transmit understanding. And recently, Rennie and colleagues found that even among conservative Americans, if you teach people just very briefly how climate change works, then people are more inclined to accept it. And he has this website about how climate change works, and you can download there the different videos where he sort of explains it. He explains it in 48 seconds. There's a 1.5-minute version. And how many minutes am I in? I want to show one of these.
4 minutes, well, you've done 26 minutes.
Okay, that's good, I get there. So I'm just going to show you the, I think, 1.5-minute version, if it works. Is that sound? Because that's kind of, okay. Oh no, it's a 3-minute version, but oh no, it's supposed to be saying something, and I don't hear anything. Okay. It's not absolutely essential, so if it doesn't work, then you can.
Let's see if this does anything. Who knows? Oh, incoming video call. We don't want that.
No, we don't want a video call now.
No, I wouldn't.
Okay, I'm just going to skip this, but anyway, believe me when I say, very succinctly, he explains how climate change works. So, this understanding transforms us from sort of merely passive recipients of knowledge to people who at least can use some reasons to think about whether we should or shouldn't accept the expertise that is being transmitted to us. So the remaining few minutes, I'm just going to talk briefly about Maimonides, who is a 12th century Jewish philosopher, born in Cordoba, moved to Fez in Morocco, which was a really interesting sort of period because both Cordoba and Fez, you had, it was Muslim rule, but you had, of course, very prominently Aristotelian philosophy, which was coming in, Christianity, Judaism. So you had lots of experts that were disagreeing about all sorts of things. It was perplexing, and that's why Maimonides wrote the Guide for the Perplexed. The Guide for the Perplexed is actually written for, ostensibly, for a student who just is perplexed by all this information. And so he says, just like, make it easy for you. Christian philosophy is no good. Muslim philosophy is no good. Jewish philosophy is really cool. And, and then all sorts of things about the existence of God, negative theology, and so on. So it basically does provide quite some heuristics for the student that he's not just a passive recipient, but that he can actively engage in the knowledge process. So I'm just going to look briefly at these heuristics because I think they're interesting. I don't know what you make of it. So first and for all, so Maimonides writes about the so-called sages. And the sages are rabbis from the first 5 centuries, and they have a special status in Judaism. So lots of contemporary Judaism is actually more informed by the stuff that they wrote, their commentaries, than it is by the Tanakh, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And in fact, they were really revered as these big experts. So then you had the question, why do they contradict each other? What does that mean? What are we to make of how do we evaluate these experts? And so he provides some ways of dealing with that. First, he says, you should never screen off your own reasons when you defer to these rabbis. So he has great respect for them, but he does offer some notes of caution. He writes, it is not proper to abandon matters of reason that have already been verified by proofs, shake loose of them, and depend on the words of a single one of the sages. So especially if there's just one of them, you should be very careful, he says, from whom possibly the matter was hidden. A man should never cast his reason behind him, for the eyes are set in front, not in the back. And it's full of these beautiful metaphors like that. He also cautioned against the Halio effect, which is interesting, in the sense that he said the proper domain of these rabbis is the transmission and interpretation of the Tanakh. It's not science. They don't know, they're not as knowledgeable as people now are about science, which was quite revolutionary, because there was this idea that people had really great knowledge and then you had a sort of decline of the generations. So he says here, do not ask me to show that everything the sages have said concerning astronomical matters conforms to the way really things are, for at that time mathematics were imperfect. They didn't speak about this as transmitters of the dicta of the prophets, but rather because in those times there were men of knowledge in those fields, or because they had heard these dicta from the men of knowledge who lived in those times. So he says, look, we're now in much about the state, which is, I think, really interesting. He also found it really important to try to understand if there is a disagreement between the sages, you have to try to see where that disagreement comes from. So here, for example, is a really interesting example of the coming of Elijah and the timing of that and the advent of the Messiah, which is something that people wonder what's going to happen. Is Elijah going to make a short appearance and then the Messiah comes, or they're coming at the same time? Anyway, he says, some of our sages say that the coming of the Elijah will precede in the advent of the Messiah, but no one is in a position to know the details of this and similar things until they have come to pass. They are not explicitly stated by the prophets, nor have the rabbis any tradition with regard to these matters. They are guided solely by what the scriptural texts seem to imply, hence there is a divergence of opinion upon the matter. So he says, basically, they're just guessing. They don't have any sort of special authority in this regard. It's not explicitly stated in the Tanakh, so basically, you don't have to sort of put a lot of weight on this. So even if you are a relative novice on the matter, Maimonides was not, he was an expert, obviously, but the person that he purportedly wrote the Guide for the Perplexed for was a relative novice. He gives the following heuristics. You should use your own reason to screen off outrageous or implausible claims. You should think about the cultural influence and limitations, especially for past experts. You should resist halo effects and see the scope of what the experts are saying. And you have to try to get a sense about, if experts disagree, why is that? Where is it coming from? So anyway, to briefly conclude, I think that I'm not saying that in every situation teachers are experts and so on, or the other way around. Hopefully most of the time teachers are experts, but it's not always the case that it's the other way around. But I think that it does capture something about how human cultural evolution and transmission works. It explains how expertise can be transmitted, how we can have innovation, and I've sort of briefly pointed at a possible model of what we can do when we're confronted with teachers who know much more than us, and to sort of still try to be in a position to make reasonable assessments about who to trust. Thank you.
So we have 15 minutes for questions, so I'm going to ask you to keep them very short, please. Any? Yes.
Thank you very much. If I may, one interesting question that I think has come up a lot in modern science, particularly in climate science, is up to recently, there's sort of an inherent assumption that because somebody is an expert in this particular little area here, that their view of the big picture is also reliable. But of course, we're beginning to realize now that that's not necessarily true. And in fact, of course, as you know, in a court of law, as has happened many times in the States, if you look hard enough, you can find a minimum of one advisor who will say smoking isn't that bad for you, etc., etc. You know, of course you can. And so the picture is beginning to move that if you want to know something about smoking or climate science, it's more reliable to look at what do the Royal Society say about this, or what does the National Science Foundation Society say about this. In other words, what I'm saying is the role of the individual specialist is often confused with the role of the expert.
Yeah.
Particularly in climate change, we've got a whole lot of different sciences involved. What you call an expert seems to be very much up for debate nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's interesting to note that there is a worry about the sort of halo effect that I was discussing, that people will take somebody and say, oh, he has a PhD in something, and therefore he can say things like smoking is actually good for you, and he has a PhD in linguistics or something like that. And I think that there is a special status for sort of statements like that. I mean, there's a reason why, if the American Pediatric Society, for instance, makes a statement about putting babies on the back, that it has a special authoritative value because there is agreement between experts, which I do think has a positive investigative status. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I mean, if I understand right, to this day in America in a court case, it's literally one scientific advisor versus another.
Yeah,
and it's much more interesting when the person has a PhD in lung cancer and they're still saying smoking is good for you.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look hard enough, you will find one. That's where the problem really is.
Yeah, that's good. So that definitely shows that you have to be careful of halo effects.
Thanks. I was really struck by this connection between kind of cheap signals of expertise and this kind of byproduct of being good at imparting it. Because I thought there were some things to unpick there. So one was something like, I take it when Sturani's talking about his capacity to signal as a birder, he's talking about a relatively small community where there are kind of a whole set of norms that the experts and the pseudo experts already have. And it's a virtue of that he's able to do the cheap signaling. And I kind of worry that when we move from those kinds of closeted communities, as it were, to the sort of cases that we're in, where I'm talking about, I don't know nothing about physicists, the physicists are telling me something, and I'm trying to think of them as a sort of good teacher or something like that, the signal will suddenly become much, much easier to fake.
Oh yeah,
And
definitely.
so I take this as kind of interesting kind of worry here, where I think that this point about being a good teacher, being a byproduct of being able to do signaling and stuff, and us being able to tell that people are good teachers in some way, is only going to work in relatively restricted domains, right? Where I've got to have already bought into the birding community in certain ways for me to be able to recognize the true birders from the fakers.
Yeah.
And so I worry that in the context of this discussion, where we're more sort of going, I've got a range of different experts, it doesn't look like that point's going to do much work for us.
Yeah. I don't think, not much explanatorily hangs on that. It's just that I was trying to make a link between why are expert expertise and teaching so closely related? Because it's still the case. Suppose that I want to learn something about birds, and Kim Strelny, I mean, I wouldn't talk about birds because Kim Strelny wanted to talk to them about philosophy, but anyway, suppose that, you know,
If you were interested in birds.
birds, okay, so he would sort of tell me a bit about, oh yeah, these birds are kind of, yeah, I don't know anything about birding, so here's where it ends. So anyway, there's some bird talk, and I listen to the bird talk, etc. Now, presumably, and so that's where the teaching comes for free. I mean, there might be extra cognitive capacities that have to be sort of generated to do that, but it's really easy for him to do that. Now, in principle, suppose that you're sort of like a malevolent bird appears, where you say, oh, while in Australia I picked up all this birding stuff from Kim Strelny, and you faked this to me. It's still going to be a lot of effort that you have to put in it. You have to buy binoculars you're only going to use for the purpose of deceiving me that you're a birder, and that sort of thing. So it does seem that you do have to. It's going to be an extra cost for you to transmit, and I think that was Strelny's point, to be able to fake transmit to me. That investment he doesn't have to make because he can, you know, build on his expertise to do it sort of cheaply. So you can still be the victim of a fake bird transmitter, but that person needs to then do the extra efforts to sort of at least look plausibly like a fake.
So I just wanted to, I guess it's a question of clarification about how your view differs from the people who set itself against
Yeah.
and Lackey. And so one of the things I think you said that was sort of problematic about your views, lack of view maybe as well, is that they say some sensible things about which experts to trust, but they don't really give you very much to go on about how to go about
Yeah.
trusting the right one. But I kind of felt like, you know, if you're coming up with an expert, they're kind of telling you things, but then you've got to decide to believe them. So some of the things you were bringing up about the teachers, that sounds quite sensible, but I wonder why the opponents can't avail themselves of the same kind of mechanisms, just to say, well, look, if I'm getting advice from somebody, I need to make sure that,
Yeah.
you know, they're the right kind of person.
Maybe the advice model would work as well. I don't know. I mean, the advice model gives a lot of autonomy to the person, right? I mean, it seems to me that the deference that you have to do is absolutely minimalistic on the advice model. I mean, after all, it's you who, in the case of the expert witnesses, I mean, as you say, you can take any expert or something in that case. So. And the same with the personal trainer and all, it's also ultimately. Whereas with the teaching, I mean, you still want to learn some new stuff. So it's not just about what do I decide to do, but it's more about what kind of knowledge do I want to. So I think in that respect, the teaching model works better than the advisor model. That's actually the answer. And Balzac-Zapsky's model, the problem is that her model doesn't really accommodate disagreement all that well, because there you have these experts. Your track record is worse than any of them, so what do? You would almost have to know which of them has the better track record, and then you have to presumably, I suppose that's how she would go, look at how good the track record is of these people, and you have to avail yourself of that information. So it seems quite complex, but not going to
Yeah, I guess it's the,
yeah.
well,
So thank you very much. I really like the module that you're putting forward, but I think similarly as some others, I wonder kind of like how feasible it is. For example, it might take me like multiple years to catch up on all this knowledge in astrophysics to make a considered decision. And I think that was motivating someone who did very in the first case, like someone who
Yeah.
So how far can you go?
Yeah. Yeah, the thing with the teaching is you have some sort of relationship with them in some sense. I mean, suppose you're a student, you're an archaeology student, and you have all these professors and they have all these different views, and then you can start thinking, okay, which of my teachers is right? What kind of archaeological method or something should I follow? But obviously if you're, I mean, I don't know how to transfer this model, so that's something I'm still thinking about. Okay, I want to know about, say, should I eat red meat or not, and there's all these different opinions out there, and how do I deal with that? So I think you can still use Maimonides' sort of model about looking about what is the domain of expertise, and What reasons would they have, sort of like, you know, conflict of interest and that sort of thing. And you can do that. It would take you some time, obviously, to research all those things about those experts, but it's not unfeasible for a non-expert to do.
Thanks. Just a quick question. I like the way you've threaded in the Maimonides' point at the end. I was wondering why prefer his particular lesson that you're drawing from to an alternative one that involves further outsourcing to experts. Suppose I see two experts who disagree. A la Maimonides, I would think about some considerations that might favor one versus the other and use my own reason in a certain way that doesn't involve checking my reason at the door. What recommends that approach rather than thinking like this? I'm not necessarily endorsing this, I'm just wondering. That I will try to outsource to the experts anything that I'm not an expert at. And one of those things is working out what kind of considerations would help to adjudicate experts. So rather than to try to use my amateurish mechanisms to try to work out how to trust an expert, just let me outsource this to the social epistemologist or something like that. I'm not suggesting doing that.
I feel sort of progressive experts coming in. Yeah.
This would certainly violate Maimonides' advice, but I wonder if it would necessarily. I wonder what you think about that suggested way of violating his advice.
Yeah, that puts a load of responsibility on us philosophers, especially epistemologists. That would be good news, actually. Yeah, we should go with that and say, come to us. We will tell you which experts to trust. Yeah, but what sort of reasons would they give rather than this sort of heuristics? I mean, it's quite nice to find this in a 12th century source, but it's not sort of like super sophisticated, right? I mean, it seems quite some commonsensical, the sort of things that he discusses, and I'm just wondering how complex, I don't want to be skeptical about epistemological limits about what we can say. So I'm just wondering what the extra value. I wouldn't be prima facie against if there were a good reason to do that.
It just struck me that actually it's quite interesting sometimes to ask where things fail, where the heuristics lead us down a totally false path. Going back to your first point about benevolence, it did suddenly strike me that actually this is in some sense an explanation for why homeopathy, for example, quacks like that. They transmit great empathy and benevolence, but actually they do harm.
Yeah.
They gain credibility by appearing to be benevolent.
Yes, that's right, yeah. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. So I was
Yeah.
discussing this with the author,
How do fakes get a reputation as being experts when they aren't?
I think in the case of homeopathy, it must be to some extent sort of confirmation bias like things like, I took Dr. Vogel and it really worked.
Yes.
You know, that sort of things. And I mean, there is a sort of worry within the homeopathic community that, you know, the things aren't quite recognized, but they say, look, the NHS, does the NHS pay this sort of stuff back for people who get refunds? I don't know. But anyway, I know in the Netherlands, for instance, that your health insurance pays it back. So there is a kind of credibility. I mean, it doesn't seem wholly irrational for people who take homeopathy to believe it works.
That's debatable.
Yeah, I know, I'm just talking about, given the information
National
I
Health
have.
Service in England has abandoned homeopathy.
Despite the advice of Prince Charles.
Despite the advice.
Oh.
It's actually, there are fields, I think, like, for example, nutrition, where these little tribes of apparently experts pop up all the time.
Yeah.
For example, clean eating is a
Yes.
current fact. Well, it's a whole crop of experts, but their expertise is based on nothing more than a handful of very nice YouTube videos.
Yeah.
And I think not learn more about how to distinguish between experts and non-experts by looking at the cases where fake experts.
That's right.
Yeah, but there you have a whole field of fakes. There are no genuine homeopaths, that's the problem. And that's a sort of separate question, I think, about that. How do you know if a whole field of expertise is bogus? I think that's sort of
Anyway,
a separate
just a
question.
thought.
Yeah.
So this isn't really a question, it's just something to think about. So I was just thinking, so I mean, the teaching model is really nice with regards to like transferring expertise, right?
Yeah.
So I was kind of wondering, it seems to me in some ways that so transferring expertise is really not the paradigm case of expertise in action, really. I mean, the paradigm case, I think, is where there's someone who's the expert, and then there's a layperson. And the layperson is still a layperson after getting the expertise.
Oh, yeah,
so,
definitely.
But in the teaching model, it seems like when the teaching is done, I'm almost an expert.
Yeah, you
at that
become an
moment.
expert.
Right.
You're in the process of becoming an expert.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
so I'm just wondering. So, I mean, this is like a counterexample or anything. I mean, you said that there are, experts aren't necessarily teachers, but it does seem to capture, like the teaching model does seem to capture something that's quite distinct from the regular, ordinary thing that happens.
Yeah, so I'm still thinking my way through that. So the stuff about the cumulative culture was there in part to say that it isn't as exceptional as we would think. I mean, if you think about large swaths of human evolution, how did expertise get transmitted? Through teaching. And within small communities, there was some division of labor, but not the amount of division of labor that we have now. So now we have an enormous sort of division of cognitive labor that is unprecedented, and it poses its own challenges. But I think over a large part of human evolution, you didn't have quite that amount of division of cognitive labor. So that's why I think it's still a good cognitive model to think about how expertise is transmitted. But I don't think that it captures each and every case.
Well, I think we can thank our speaker now for once before.
Perhaps get a little bit more light.
Yes.
Would be great.